Welcome to my talk on wireless witnessing and crowdsourcing for air traffic communication security. This was a longer introduction of myself just now, but I also have another slide that I just would like to show you to give you an idea about some more ideas about the topics that we are working on as a group. We are, I'm heading the cybersecurity and privacy lab, and we have three core areas where our research activities focus on. The first one is, there's no particular order here, but the first one is mobile and cellular network security, where we are interested in understanding better the security of the existing systems, so 4G, 5G systems that are actually pretty well secured, and in understanding better where still attacks are possible and how we can make the systems more secure. So this is the first area. The second area where we are working on is secure localization and aviation, where it's a pretty much different story from the security context, because these systems, these aviation systems, are typically not as well secured as, for example, mobile and cellular network systems. So here we are mainly interested in understanding how we can detect attacks, how we can propose countermeasure to make those systems more secure under the constraints that they are operating in. And the third major area of research is on anonymity and privacy and communication networks in general. This includes Tor as anonymity system, also the security of messenger services, social online networks, privacy aspects in those, timing side channels and web environments, and so on. And here we are investigating both attack and defense sides with equal focus, I would say. So in this talk for this workshop, my focus is obviously on the area of secure localization and aviation, and this is where I will dive into details now. So let me start with giving some broader context when it comes to the intersection of like civil aviation and cybersecurity. What are actually the intersection points that make it interesting to look at? So there are, I would say, four main pillars where civil aviation and cybersecurity intersect, overlap. The first one is, well, when it comes to airlines, there are security questions about like the classical IT systems, the privacy of customer records, sensitive data about the companies. So that's a very classic area of security. There's also the aspect of security of the airports, like when it comes to access control, when it comes to security screening, and so on. So these are classical security systems, but they are, I would say, both not so interesting from the research perspective. So I will leave them out in the rest of this talk. What I would like to focus on are the aspects where like aircraft are kind of the target of the attack. So when it comes to the in-flight aircraft control system, for example, or when it comes to the onboard aircraft IP network that is being used, this is an interesting context, as well as in general air traffic control. So here, this is about communication between aircraft, from aircraft to control center. It's about navigation, it's about surveillance and the systems that are used for this, with the goal of collision avoidance, with the goal of situational awareness, and so on. And this is basically interested. So these two sides are more interesting and are the interesting parts from the security perspective. And the focus of my talk is on the rightmost aspect, so the air traffic control and the security of air traffic control systems. Okay, but with that in mind, I would like to introduce the two widely deployed wireless systems, widely deployed and widely used in aircraft communication, that the research contributions that we've made are focusing on or have focused on. And the first one is GPS, as we all are aware of. That's the system that is used for positioning, for navigation, also for time synchronization, and a wide variety of application settings. And there's also the ADSB system, so the automatic dependent surveillance broadcast system that started to be put in place a couple of years ago and has been mandatory since 2020 in the US, and is coming more and more widely deployed and is becoming basically the de facto standard that is in use today. with the goal of situational awareness, with the goal of providing good self-separation between aircraft and just making the airspace system more secure and safer. What does it stand for? The ADSB, so A standing for automatic, meaning that it transmits information without any pilot or operator input. There are messages sent twice a second from the aircraft. It is dependent, the D coming from the dependency on the GPS system. So that's the link between GPS and ADSB, because position and velocity vectors are derived from the GPS system and then being forwarded in the ADSB messages. The S in ADSB stands for surveillance. It's a method that is used for determining the positions of the aircraft. And the B standing for broadcast, meaning that the information is available to everybody with the appropriate equipment. Everybody can record those messages and use them. Now, when we look at those two systems, when we look at the security research, what are actually the characteristics that make it interesting to look at? For GPS, on one hand, what characterizes GPS is that we have one-way communication systems here. So the satellite transmits navigation messages that are received on ground or in the air from aircraft, but in the form of one-way communication. So we only have the communication from the satellite to the GPS receiver, wherever it is. It is public data that is sent, so there's no secret that is sent, but it's public data. It's only about the timings that this data arrives at a certain location, and this timing data will determine the location of the receiver. And well, GPS and its commercial, the civil GPS system is also unrestricted in use, so everybody can make use of that. What makes it hard to secure still, although like after almost like 2 decades of research on securing a GPS system with a lot of contributions that have been made, the inherent difficulty is still that signal arrival times are hard to secure. While we can secure messages pretty well, we can have integrity protection, we can have, in general, we can use cryptography in general for communication systems to protect the payload of messages. Protecting signal arrival times, it's much harder, or detecting when something is wrong in the signal arrival times. And that's, I would say, is the inherent difficulty for securing systems like GPS. On the other hand, for ADSB, there we have airplane to airplane communication or airplane to the ground station. There is in some form mutual information that is exchanged, because we can have data that is being sent from one aircraft to the other, and then also from the second aircraft back to the first aircraft. So we have some form of two-way communication, but it's not a classical two-way protocol. So there's no dependency on the messages that are being sent out on the messages that are being received. So it's still like two one-way communications that are happening. We also have public use here. There are a variety of services and networks like flight radar, radar cave, OpenSky network that are collecting this information that is being sent and are making that publicly available. But here, the difficulty for securing ADSB is actually, it's not that we wouldn't know how to make it more secure. So we could protect the messages, protect payload of messages by encryption, but this is not how the system is being used today. So messages are sent in plain text. There is no integrity protection. There is no inherent protection in terms of confidentiality. But the difficulty to secure ADSB is actually the slow regulatory processes. So changing something in the aircraft industry is something that takes a long time, that involves a lot of money as well. And this is what makes the system harder to secure. Okay, so we have a bit different difficulties for the two systems here. Now, why should we think about security of those systems in the first place? Well, let me just mention that basically the barriers for conducting attacks have become pretty small. When we look maybe 15 years back, we actually needed special purpose devices in order to mount attacks. We don't have cryptographic protection mechanisms, neither for GPS nor for ADSB, but we still needed back then special purpose devices to actually transmit those messages, transmit those signals, and interfere with the communication. Over time, this has become way more affordable and simpler to achieve. So a couple of years ago, 10 years ago, GPS satellite simulators were available that were basically built for testing equipment and for making the GPS modules on devices for basically testing them, but they could also be used for creating fake data and inserting that in networks. But what we see nowadays is that all of that is basically can be done by software attacks. So using some general software-defined radios like user keys and using now publicly available modules, software-defined software can actually be used in order to first receive the data that is being sent out, but also to transmit that. You would need some amplifiers for that to go far enough and cover certain distances, but this has become widely available, and the costs for mounting attacks have really gone down. Now, does it happen in reality? Well, the feasibility of like doing attacks like that has been shown years ago. Here's an example from the University of Texas, where Ted Humphreys with his group actually demonstrated that in reality that a yacht could be lured to go off track by sending fake GPS signals. So that's something that has been demonstrated. We increasingly also see and read about reports that this is what is happening. Here's an example from China, where GPS spoofing incidents have been reported. So this is something that is happening in reality. And that's also something that to a certain level, the Federal Aviation Association, so FAA from the US, is acknowledging. They have already in 2015, so 6 years ago, they have acknowledged that a lot of the less intentional attacks are possible, also pinpointed spoofing attacks. So like the example on the yacht on the slide before, this is something that they have observed, that has been demonstrated, that we know can be done. But also more coordinated spoofing attacks. Well, in 2015, there were no public records on that, at least for the civil context. We now, and here is just a link from 2021, so from this year, is something that this is happening in reality. Maybe not the way, like the way how we are getting aware of that, how the public is getting aware of that. Here's an example that actually military GPS tests, where the military performs tests in order to make their systems more secure, result in jamming and spoofing GPS signals that have been demonstrated or have been known to actually have had impact on aircraft that are flying. So that was certainly not the purpose of these military operations, but it's something that is happening in reality, and will probably also happen more in the future when other actors take that up. So it is a real threat. This was my introduction to the topic. And what I would like to do now is I would like to focus on basically two research contributions that we have made. So the first part that I will talk about is countering GPS spoofing in civil aviation, detecting that an attack is happening, and also localizing the attacker. That's the first part that I will, or the second part of this talk that I will talk about. And then the third part will be about countering ADSB spoofing. So the focus on the ADSB system and our like experiences with an experimental work with building an ADSB trust system. Okay, so let me jump into the first part on countering GPS spoofing in civil aviation. This is a joint work with Kai Jansen from Ruhr University Bochum, Matthias Schäfer, Daniel Moser, Vincent Lenders, and Jens Schmidt from OpenSky Network / ArmaSwiss / the Technical University in Kaiserslautern. All right. So I mentioned that what we are talking about is basically this infrastructure here with ADSB increasingly in place. That is an interaction point between the aircraft that are transmitting signals and the area control center, or the ground stations that are collecting this data and using that for observing what is going on in the airspace. I mentioned that ADSB is using GPS signals for determining and sending out the location data from the aircraft. What I what I focus on now, what I will present to you, is the detection and localization of GPS spoofing attacks. So attacks on the aircraft here, where fake GPS data is inserted, by doing this detection and localizing of the attacker using the ADS-B data. So this is the idea here, using the ADS-B data to actually detect attacks that are happening on the GPS system on the aircraft. And I will very shortly at the end have 1 or 2 additional slides on a second system that we have proposed recently, but let me focus on the first one, on the Crowd GPS SEC system first. So what is the idea? The idea is that we have the aircraft that are transmitting ADS-B data that contains their location information that is being collected by sensors, and we do make use of real-world data that is collected from the OpenSky network. So we're using the ADS-B data and FLARM data that is used by smaller aircraft that is collected by the OpenSky network. Now, when we have a GPS spoofer, when there is an attack and the GPS spoofer is targeting aircraft, what is happening, and what we can assume to happen, is when the attack is successful, then fake location data will be reported in the messages and the ADS-B messages that the aircraft transmit to the ground sensor network. What do we do? What we are interested in is, in the first place, identifying that the spoofing attacks are happening. So looking at the spoofing incident, are we able to identify that? And then also going beyond that, trying to identify the location of the spoofer. So from where is the spoofer actually transmitting those fake signals? Can we limit the area from where the signals can be transmitted beyond what is just possible by the ranges of the signal? And as I mentioned, we do use OpenSky data, so ADS-B data collected by the OpenSky data for our kind of proof of concept evaluation of the system that we are proposing. So we are using real-world data for our investigations. Now let me come to the conceptual idea. First one regarding spoofing detection. Spoofing detection, there are actually 2 ways of doing that. How can we identify that a spoofing attack is happening? The first one is that we compare the ADS-B reported locations that we find in the messages that are received on the ground network, and compare that with other localization techniques, and in particular the multilateration MLAT system that is being used can be used to verify whether ADS-B reported location data is correct. That's the first one. If for the same aircraft 2 different locations are reported, and here different beyond standard errors that we can assume, so we will never be exactly precise, but beyond standard errors that we can assume, then this is a strong indication that an attack is likely to happen. This is the first technique. The second technique is actually to compare ADS-B reports from multiple aircraft. So the location data that is reported in those ADS-B messages from different aircraft, and if they are similar enough, so if they are actually indicating that the aircraft would be at the same location, again within certain error bounds, then this is also an attack. Then this is also an indication that an attack is happening. And the reason behind that actually goes back to a work that we did years ago, 10 years ago actually, by demonstrating that when the same fake ADS-B signals are being received at 2 different locations, at 2 different GPS receivers, then they will report the same fake data. So they will report the same fake location information, and that's exactly the idea that we are using here. So if locations reported from 2 aircraft are too similar at the same point in time, then this is also an indication of an attack. Now let's assume we have this spoofing detection system up and running, and we are able to detect when a spoofing attack is happening. I mentioned we would like to go further and also determine from where the attacker is actually transmitting the signals. And what's the idea for us to make use of that? Well, we are using spoofer localization. And the way how we are doing that, the idea is that we will make use of the timeline of when these signals are being, so the signals from the aircraft containing the fake GPS positions are being reported where on the track an aircraft appears to be. We are using that data to actually run kind of an inverse multilateration system for determining the location, the position of the spoofer. I will explain that on the following slides in a bit more detail, but that's the overall idea. And based on that, we then run experiments to identify which performance we actually get by that. So how precise are we able to determine the location of the attacker, and what are the requirements for us to do that? And this is based on simulations on real-world OpenSky data. Okay, so let's look into this technique in more detail. When we have aircraft multilateration, the way how that works is, well, the aircraft is transmitting ADS-B messages that are being recorded from multiple sensor locations. Let's assume from these 2 locations here. And the distance correlates to, well, the time of flight from the aircraft to the sensors. So if it takes longer, if the signal arrives later at sensor 2, then it's an indication that the aircraft is further away from sensor 2 than for sensor 1. And we can put up an equation that actually correlates the physical distances between the aircraft and the sensors, and relating that to the time difference of arrival of when the signal is being received at these 2 sensor locations, at these 2 sensors. And what we get basically, and that's a similar idea that also GPS is using, we will get a hyperbole, or in 3D, a hyperpoloid of locations where the aircraft, from where the aircraft can have transmitted the signal, such that it's arrived at those 2 sensor locations with the same time difference of arrival. If we add more sensors to that, we get more equations of the same type. Here we are adding basically 2 more equations. We are getting more hyperboles or hyperboloids that determine from where the aircraft ADS-B signals can have been sent. And if we do that, then we basically have a way for classical aircraft multilateration to locate where the aircraft is, all within certain error bounds. So errors happen here. There's some uncertainty about that, but that's the core idea. Now we take exactly this idea and have a look at what happens in a spoofing case. What is happening in the spoofing case? So when we have a GPS spoofer, the spoofer will send the fake data, and this fake data will be received at a certain airspace. And when there are multiple aircraft, for example, these 2 aircraft here that receive those fake GPS signals, then they will both report the wrong data, the wrong data in their ADS-B messages. Now, since the GPS spoofer is spoofing aircraft, the spoofing will be kind of a spoof track. So it will try to imitate a wrong track for the aircraft. And what we have, due to different times of arrivals of these fake attacker signals at the 2 aircraft, when we look at what these aircraft report, we will actually get locations on the spoof track that are not at the same point in time, but basically the aircraft appear to be at different locations on the spoof track at the same point in time. So we get a certain distance here on the spoof track of where the aircraft appear to be. Now we are using this idea of basically the distances that we have observed there for us to be able to locate the spoofer. And how do we do that? So the principal idea is as follows. We use the same idea of relating the times of flight from the spoofer to the aircraft as earlier, the other way around, from the aircraft to the sensors. And basically this time difference of arrival gives us again this equation system where we have a hyperboloid, or a hyperbole in 2D, hyperboloid in 3D, where the attacker can actually be positioned now. We can do the same. And so this is the example for 2 aircraft. We would just know that the attacker is somewhere on a hyperboloid. If we have more aircraft that are reporting their location data based on this fake attacker data, we get more of those systems. We again get more of the equations and can then use the same idea to identify the location of where the spoofer is actually located. This is the core idea of our proposal. So we are kind of in a certain way turning the idea of multilateration around. Instead of localizing aircraft, we are using the same principles to actually localize the attacker. This whole thing, however, depends on, well, here this is the distance between like the two aircraft reports on the same track, on the spoofed track. So this was the distance that I showed before. It's not exactly the time difference of arrival that we had in the multilateration case, but it relates to this distance on the spoofed track. And we have to normalize that by, actually, we get a dependency on the speed of this aircraft track, on the spoofed track that the attacker is trying to insert. So there's a parameter v in this equation here that starts to matter. So the speed of the spoofed track starts to matter. And as we can see, we have v in the denominator, so it cannot be 0. So the system that we are proposing will not work for stationary detection, but we need moving devices. We need movement in that. We need a certain velocity, and the faster the aircraft are, or the spoofed attacker track is, the more precise we will be in our determination of the attacker location. So we used this idea and then basically set up a simulation system. We used real-world data from the OpenSky network, but we do not have, and we did not want to insert fake data directly in the network by transmitting that over the air. That would be illegal. So we use simulations to basically understand better how fast the track needs to be, for example. So in that example here on this, what is shown on that slide here, you see different velocities for the spoofed track, from 6 kilometers per hour to about 1,000 kilometers per hour. And we see the faster the spoof track is, the smaller the distance, the determined. So when we determine the attacker location, then the smaller the distance, the real distance to the real spoofer location will be. So we get higher precision in our localization of the attacker if the attacker is transmitting fake data for faster aircraft tracks. If we are looking at commercial airplanes, then we are easily like in this range here of this green curve. And this gives us the idea, the faster this is, the more precise we will be in determining the spoofer location. This can also go wrong. It will, in some cases, that will fail if the aircraft are not fast enough, or obviously if we don't have enough data that is available. But if we have enough data that is available, then this is the way how it works. So this is to give you the idea of the system that we proposed. If I want to summarize that, this core idea, then it's really this idea here that is shown on the slides, that we use the idea of multilateration and use this idea not to localize the aircraft, but localize the spoofer by that. We have to do a couple of adjustments. So our target is not the aircraft, it's the spoofer. Our reference is not the sensors, but actually the aircraft that are transmitting this fake information. Our measure is not the time, but the position on that fake craft, on this fake track, and therefore we need a scaling factor where the velocity actually matters. But on part of these small differences, the idea is very similar to standard multilateration. Now, what can this be used for, and what is the benefit of doing it? It's when I summarize the idea here, then it's doing GPS spoofer localization actually through, so not directly based on the GPS data that is being reported, but through indirect measurements of the ADS position broadcast in the ADS-B messages that are sent by the aircraft. That's the first proposal that I am, or we were aware of, that is using such indirect measurement for determining GPS spoofing attacks. Nicely, this works without line of sight connection between the ADS-B receiver and the spoofer. So our ADS-B receivers that are reporting the ADS-B signals do not need to have, and do not need to receive the spoofing signals directly, and there does not need to be a line of sight connection, as long as the spoofer signals are received by the aircraft that are then transmitting the ADS-B data to the receivers. That will work. And we also don't need actually extra infrastructure for doing this, because it all relies on data that is all, so the sensors, monitoring sensors are deployed already, and we are able to basically use the infrastructure that exists already. I would like to leave it at that level of detail here. So this is a system that will work for as long as aircraft are fast enough in the way how when they go, because we have this factor, this velocity in the denominator here for that system to work. So we need aircraft to be fast enough, and the spoofing tracks also need to be fast enough for that to work. Now, let me just mention what we can do with like a completely different approach or a different proposal for actually being able to detect GPS spoofing attacks when we have vehicles like UAVs that might not hover or fly with the necessary speed. So what can we do in such a case when we are looking at UAVs, and how we can detect GPS spoofing attacks on UAVs and drones? We cannot necessarily use the system that I just introduced before. They won't typically use ADS-B data. What can we do in this case? And here I just want to give the rough idea without going into too many details. And the idea is as follows. Typically UAVs, so we use satellite image matching. What does it mean? So the UAVs typically have a camera. They can take, if the conditions allow, they can typically take pictures of the ground plane where they are, and then compare that. So they are also using GPS data, so they have typically a GPS a module on board, and then we can actually compare the claimed GPS location. We can use that to actually look up the location on existing satellite images. The satellite images of areas are publicly available, and we can use the aerial photos that UAVs are taking and compare them to satellite images of where the UAV would expect to be based on the GPS data that it has, and then actually do a comparison and see, is that likely that the UAV is indeed at that location. So we use that idea as well to basically run to develop a deep learning model to run and compare the pictures taken live while flying, and comparing that to expected location from satellite images. And if there is sufficient, well, if it looks sufficient likely that it's the same location, then everything would proceed as normal. But if it looks like this is a different location than what the UAV thinks to be at, then there could be a spoofing indicator that actually shows that something may be going wrong. And what you see here, just a couple of examples that illustrate that better. So on the bottom row, these are the satellite images that we can preload from Google Maps or from other services that provide those images. And on the higher, the first row, you see aerial photos taken by UAVs. And just by visually looking at that, we see that there are features that are similar, and we use the idea to actually identify if we are at the right location, if the UAV is at the location that it thinks it is based on the GPS data. Now, obviously, in this example here, the aerial photos are already nicely adjusted to imitate the satellite image part of what is shown there. So we see a lot of similarities here. In reality, there are a number of obstacles to overcome, because obviously the images will be a different resolution. There will be different rotations. There will be weather conditions that matter. Buildings may have been rebuilt, or things have changed in the environment, in the landscape between the satellite image being taken and the aerial photo being taken, and so on. So there are a number of challenges to overcome. But just by using this idea, we actually demonstrated that if the conditions are sufficiently favorable, so if we are not in total fog, or if we are not in the desert or over the ocean, because there it will not work, because we don't have sufficient features from the landscape that would allow us to actually do this comparison, then we are still, so if conditions are more favorable, then we are actually able to get kind of good results for that. So for feature-rich landscapes, and also by using some form of data augmentation, so still accounting for some changes of the environmental conditions, having some clouds, can be darker at night, or brighter or foggy conditions, as long as features of the environment, of the landscape, can still be recognized. That's an idea what we can use for GPS spoofing detection on UAVs. With that, I would like to stop talking about GPS spoofing attacks. So these were two contributions that we have made there, at basically either directly detecting GPS spoofing attacks on UAVs or at the interconnection between the GPS system and ADSB. This was the GPS crowd, the crowd GPS. Now let me still come to the second part, or part 3 of the talk in general, where I mentioned I would be talking about countering ADSB spoofing. So what I'd addressed so far was really finding GPS spoofing attacks and reacting to that. So what we have done here is we have been focusing on the ADSB system itself, and we're interested in actually determining if attacks are happening on the ADSB system. That goes beyond, it uses GPS spoofing, but it goes beyond that because ADSB is more than GPS. Again, this is a joint work with Kai from Ruhr University in Bochum and Liang and Nian, two PhD students in my group here in Abu Dhabi, and Ivan Martinovic from the University of Oxford. So a couple of introductory slides here before I come to the main idea. When we look at ADSB signals, similarly as for GPS spoofing, what we need here as equipment for actually being able to record ADSB signals is the requirements for the equipment are pretty low. So it's low cost. There's software-defined radios. We need a couple of antennas. We need cables, but this is kind of standard equipment that doesn't need sophisticated hardware or software. It's pretty well available. There are a number of flight tracking services that exist. I show you here is from an example from the flight radar system that actually shows cargo flights on this was in early February this year. So this was during the pandemic actually, but cargo flights still go. So there are a number of those flights there. What we do use for this work here, I mentioned that before, the OpenSky network, we again make use of that. Here's an example that is actually more dense than what I showed on the slide before. It's just focusing more on Europe. That's why maybe the image doesn't look necessarily more dense, but it is more dense here. And it's actually showing data from commercial airplanes, but actually here from February last year, before well, the pandemic consequences hit in and many aircraft were grounded. So it didn't look like that busy during all of the last year, but this was an image just taken from before the pandemic set in. So we do use the OpenSky network here in terms of data. The OpenSky network has a geographic focus on Europe, and that's what you will see on the next couple of slides as well. So when we look at this data, so this was a day of data that we used from the OpenSky network sometime in February last year. Then on a typical pre-pandemic day there would be typically between 100 and 1,000 ADSB messages that are received per location, at least in Central Europe. And also there are the ADSB messages are recorded typically by a larger number of receivers on the ground, of ADSB receivers on ground, between 4 and maybe 10 or more than 10 receivers in large parts of Europe. And this is exactly the idea that we make use in our proposal here. We leverage this redundancy in our proposal, that we have data being recorded from many locations, and this will hopefully help us to identify when attacks are happening. So we use the same system as I introduced before, with the satellites, and the aircraft, the ADSB sensors on the ground. Now just a short mention about ADSB attacks, what is possible there. And I reuse a very nice graphical overview that comes from a paper that the session chair, so Mauro, was working on before. And what we see here, well, we have the authentic aircraft that are transmitting messages. What a ground-based attacker can do, it can insert ghost aircraft traffic, can do replay attacks from old data that it has recorded before, or also attack data can come from other aircraft that are transmitting wrong ICAO data, so wrong identifiers of the aircraft, for example, or insert other fake data. And our goal is to actually identify when such attacks are happening. So the question is, how trustworthy are the received ADSB messages? How can we distinguish legitimate from fake ADSB messages? A short mention about the attack attackers as well. I mentioned before that GPS spoofing attacks have become fairly simple. The same actually applies to ADS-B spoofing attacks. So here you see an example of a software-defined radio transmitter that actually has firmware that allows to receive, decode, and retransmit a whole lot of wireless protocols, including GPS and including ADS-B signals. Again, for legal compliance, we don't make use of such devices, but use simulations for our research purposes. But these devices are available. They are cheap and they are easy to use in general. Now, what do we look at? Let me come into the details to the core idea. We're actually looking at 3 different types of attacks. First one is GPS spoofing, where the received GPS signals indicate a deviation from the aircraft track by a certain angle. So we are using an angle alpha that would make the track of the aircraft deviate from the original trajectory. The second idea is ADS-B spoofing, as introduced on the 2 slides before, where the attacker can either impact one specific sensor if it's really a targeted attack on an on-ground sensor, or it can be on multiple sensors, or on a certain larger area where all sensors are impacted by the fake ADS-B signals that the attacker is inserting. And there's also the concept of sensor control, where the attacker basically fully decides which messages are being sent. So if the attacker is in control of the ground infrastructure of the ADS-B sensors on ground, then the attacker can determine which messages are forwarded to the ground station that is collecting, to the ground server that is collecting and processing all the data. So this is basically complete control of the system. Now, what is our idea? The idea is that we actually develop a trust evaluation process and system here, where we use first a number of checks. I won't go into too many details here on that, but there's the payload of the messages. So it's the content of the messages, where we can do a variety of checks. So like sanity checks, is it a realistic height that is being reported? Are the velocities realistic for what aircraft can do, for example? We can also use a differential check. So is there a sudden jump in the aircraft trajectory, or does it fulfill kind of the physical constraints of the world that we live in? So there are a number of different checks that we can do on the content that is being reported. What we also can do, and that's actually the main focus of what we do and what I would like to present here, is to focus on the metadata. And what do I mean by metadata here? Actually about the sensor coverage. And this is what we call doing some cross checks. So it's about the coverage of like a number of sensors recording the same message. Is there sufficient consistency in what the ADS-B sensors on ground are receiving? And based on this, we can actually, so when our checks fail, either the content-based checks or the metadata cross checks, we can identify, try to identify the type of attack that is happening and investigating the affected sensor as a way to then take later action. So the idea of what I will go into on the next slide will only focus on this metadata here. This is kind of the new idea. The idea of using general checks is something that exists in other systems as well. So what do we do here? And the idea is something that we call wireless witnessing, and the idea is fairly simple. When you have an aircraft that is transmitting ADS-B data that is being recorded by a set of ADS-B sensors on the ground, then if only 2 of them report data that looks fake or looks different than what the others have recorded, then probably what the aircraft is reporting is real, because a lot of sensors are showing consistent data from that aircraft, and only 2 of the ADS-B sensors on ground are reporting something that's inconsistent with it. So here, probably the data that is being received by the other sensors, by the majority of sensors, is probably real. However, if the large majority of sensors reports on something that looks, where something looks wrong, and there's only very few sensors, so we have inconsistent data, so messages not being received, for example, by a lot of those sensors, then this is an indication that probably there is something wrong. And just using basically the simple idea of the reports being received, the same reports being received at a large set of ethical locations, and having only a few locations where data is either not received at all or there's inconsistency in the data that is being received, we use this idea to actually identify attacks, identify GPS spoofing attacks, identify ADS-B spoofing attacks, identify like full sensor control attacks. We do have to make use of, so we have to create, for our investigations, we have to create attack data kind of ourselves. So we have to label the reception patterns and introduce kind of sophisticated levels of those 3 types of attacks ourselves, because we don't have data that we can extract from the real network that we could use in order to train our system. So this is the part that's not using real world data, but where we are basically creating data as we would expect to see it if an attack is happening in reality. And then we use a machine learning based approach. We actually use simple decision trees here that performed fairly well for actually doing some classical machine learning based classification afterwards. And what we get in terms of results is as follows. So first of all, let me focus on GPS and ADS-B spoofing for just a few last slides that I'm presenting here. We looked at different deviations for the GPS spoofing between 1 and 45 degrees of deviation. And then we used a sliding window approach to actually not like cause an alarm as soon as one message is received that looks wrong, but actually using a certain window of a couple of minutes, and only when there are repeated alarms during the time, then we would raise an alarm for the overall systems. So here we are talking about a couple of minutes that we need for detecting that and for ruling out false alarms, basically. And then the final decision is then based on score thresholds. That's kind of pretty obvious that we need to set thresholds where our system would raise an alarm. And by design, what we get here is we are getting actually a false positive rate of 0%. What's the reason behind that? It's really by design, because we are using the thresholds based on the data. So that's not necessarily a big achievement, but it's rather by the design of the system. We are focusing on a false positive rate of 0% by the thresholds that we set. And when we do that, we observe it for data on other days. So we trained our system with messages from ADS-B with this fake data, and then run our detection mechanisms on new data from other days. And we find that after a couple of minutes of elapsed time, that relates back to the windows that the sliding window approach, we identify like noticeable rates and drops of the average score, so indicating that an attack is happening. And obviously, the more the deviation is, the faster we are able to detect that. When it comes to ADS-B spoofing detection, we used at different scenarios. I mentioned that is only one sensor concerned, are multiple sensors concerned. Overall, it turns out that we also, after these couple of minutes, we get a clear indication of the attack. So our average scores really drop. Interestingly, though, it showed that if the attacker manages to impact multiple sensors at the same time, then this attacker strategy is actually superior from the attacker perspective. So the scores did not drop as much as when the attacker is only running the attack on a single sensor. This was fairly easy to identify. With multiple sensors, it takes longer to actually to identify that the attack is happening, but we still saw quite reasonable drops in the scoring, in the overall scoring of the system. Let me come just to the final idea here. We are using this data to distinguish between like normal operations, GPS spoofing, ADS-B spoofing. This is data that's highly, so I don't want to go too much into the numbers here, because this obviously depends on the training and on the thresholds that we are setting. In the large majority of cases, we are able to correctly classify the attack that is happening. We certainly have 100%, we had a certain 100% rate here between the normal operation and the attacks happening themselves, but the exact numbers will depend on a lot of aspects. So this let me not spend more times on the exact numbers here. Observations and lessons learned for our purposes, using very simple machine learning techniques with the decision trees actually turned out to work out pretty well. Running that, however, was a bit of the challenge, as it is with many machine learning approaches. We had 5 classifiers we ran that for like around a terabyte of data. We've made that data and the approach, our software, available as well as available on GitHub. So that's something that can be looked into further. What was interesting to learn for us, that the kind of simple decision trees actually gave us very kind of good results. So finalizing that here, the spatial redundancy of the surveillance network, using that in a collaborative manner in the idea of crowdsourcing and wireless witnessing, gives us an idea to identify the attacks. I'll just jump to the very last slide here. I hear Mauro coming back. I think I should stop talking. So we have these different systems that work on different requirements. Well, a couple of open questions that need to be solved for that. But let me just conclude. Well, we see that a one-size-fits-all solution for all cyber attacks in prevention, in particular in civil aviation, is not likely to exist. There are a lot of integration that is needed for like having an impact on the real world. With that, let me thank you for your attention. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here, and I'll be happy to take on any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, for your talk. Our pleasure to have you. I see already a question coming up. Nils, raise hand, please. I think you can speak directly, right?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Christina. Thanks for the very nice presentation. Maybe a quick question on, or 2 quick questions on the latest part that you presented on the ADSB kind of spoofing detection. One is the system that you presented looks kind of very feasible. So did you kind of deploy this already? Would you need, can you do this with the data that you're collecting already with the OpenSky network, or would you need additional data somehow from the infrastructure providers?
No. So what we are using is really just using the data as it is recorded from the ADSB sensors. So that's just something that it would be deployable right now on the ADSB or on the OpenSky network, basically on the back end, on the server that is collecting and getting all the ADSB messages. That's something that can be put up there. We have not done it yet. So all we have done is we have used the data from the network to actually run these experiments to see and to work around with like what thresholds we need to work with, how will we be able to detect that. It is currently not deployed yet. That's still something left to be done, but it would be possible to do that on the existing infrastructure, and just by the indications of like how much processing and computational effort is needed, it looks feasible to have that done on state-of-the-art servers for doing that in a form of real-time observation. I think that's what our tests have indicated. Yeah.
Sorry, that was my question as well, because you have trained everything now. So if it's just a decision tree, then I guess it should be fairly cheap to implement.
Right.
And that's I mean, you could even make like a whatever startup out of this or something like this. No, you can make a company and sell this intelligence to people for money or something. No, just an idea. Okay. Sorry, there was one. For the data set, you said you also put the code out there to reproduce the data sets. Would this reproduce the exact data sets, or is there essentially some random effects happening in the simulations that you use to produce the data sets? Because you said you simulate the attacks, so I guess there's also some channel effects that are in there.
Yes, that's right. So I should be a bit more precise. So what we have shared on the GitHub is the code that we have developed for operating on the OpenSky data. The OpenSky data is so huge that we had terabyte of data that we have not put it on the GitHub. So that's something that separately needs to be for running basically the code on data is something that needs to be, the separate data needs to be collected or retrieved from the OpenSky network. They're the same way how we did it, which is generally pretty feasible for research purposes. It's easy to get access to that. It's a request, so that has to be made to OpenSky. And then for research purposes, it was fairly simple for us to get access to this data. And this data has to be used for running the code that we are sharing on GitHub, basically. So the data itself is not there. But what is true is that we had to, so the tricky part is indeed the way how the attacks are generated for the learning procedure, right? Because only if we have data that is good enough for the attack purposes, our system will be good enough in determining that attacks are happening and then also finding them when they are deployed, right? So this is the critical part. I don't want to say that this is, nothing can be improved on that part, but we have done kind of a wide range of possibilities of attacks that we could think of, both for GPS spoofing with, as I mentioned, different angles of deviations from aircraft tracks, as well as the different types of spoofed ADS-B data that we have inserted there. And this obviously will then, I mean, it depends on the data. It's a machine learning system, so it will depend on how good the input data is in sense of what we get out of the system. I think that this in general needs further explorations. Like we use the training with data of one day. I think now currently the data looks much different. There are way less aircraft that are flying at this stage. So I think there are certainly adjustments that are thresholds that need to be adjusted depending on what we see. I think there's also a lot of real world investigations that have to be done in terms of, I mean, the problem with deploying real world systems like that is if you have, if you are getting false alarms that are too many, this kind of defeats the purpose of the system, because then you need human interaction. And if there are too many false alarms, everybody gets bored by that and nobody will use it. On the other hand, if you put the thresholds too low, then we might miss real world attacks, right? And this needs a number of extra steps to actually have that kind of in a deployable manner that is useful in reality.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we should take the discussion maybe offline as well, because Mauro probably wants to get the next session started. But thanks a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much, Christina, for answering also this question. I don't see any other raised hand. Maybe I can ask a very quick one. Please also be short in the answer. You mentioned several times that you have to rely to simulations. Of course, I mean, for legal reasons, right? Is there any let's say small scale study to get an understanding of what is the impact of simulating reading that, doing real experiments in this area?
What's the impact of simulations as opposed to real world experiments?
Yeah.
You asked about a study, and you asked for a short answer. Short answer is I'm not aware of such a study. But,
okay. So what is your understanding? I mean, is it's just a minor difference, or there can be, I mean, some significant impact?
That's to be investigated, I would say. Of course, we try to imitate the real world as much as we can, but well, no human-made system is perfect, right? So it's hard for me to answer that in general.
Okay, fair enough.
further experiments are needed. This would be my short answer.
Okay, thank you very much again, Christina. Thanks all of you for being here. I will leave the floor to the next session. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks.